3 years earlier, in 1453, the walls of Constantinople had fallen to the armies of Mehmed II, the ancient capital of the Byzantine Empire, long regarded as a shield of Christian Europe, had been breached, stormed, and absorbed into the expanding Ottoman state. The psychological shock reverberated across the continent. If Constantinople could fall, what could not? The young Ottoman Sultan was only 21 when he captured the city. He had studied its walls obsessively, marshaled unprecedented artillery, and demonstrated a patience uncommon in rulers of his age. His victory was not impulsive conquest. It was deliberate statecraft executed through force, and it changed the strategic geometry of Europe overnight. With Constantinople secured, Mehmed's ambitions did not slow. They sharpened. To the north lay the kingdom of Hungary, fragmented by internal factionalism, politically strained, yet still the strongest military power between the Ottomans and Central Europe. Beyond Hungary stretched the plains leading toward Vienna and the heartlands of the Holy Roman Empire. But before any deeper thrust into Europe could occur, a gateway had to be opened. That gateway was Belgrade. Situated at the confluence of the Danube and Sava rivers, the fortress city commanded the primary invasion route from the Balkans into the Carpathian Basin. Control Belgrade, and the Ottomans could project force directly into Hungary's core. Fail there, and expansion north would stall. Belgrade was not merely another fortress. It was the hinge of the continent. For Mehmed II, the logic was straightforward. Constantinople had been the symbolic prize. Belgrade would be the operational necessity. The Sultan understood that victory required momentum. Europe was still stunned. Its courts were divided, suspicious of one another and slow to mobilize. If pressure were applied quickly, resistance might fracture before coordination could occur. But Europe was not entirely unprepared. In Hungary, one man grasped the scale of the threat more clearly than most: John Hunyadi. Hunyadi had spent decades fighting Ottoman incursions. He had faced them in Serbia, in Wallachia, and along the southern frontiers of Hungary. He understood their operational tempo, their use of mobility, their disciplined core infantry, the Janissaries, and their reliance on overwhelming artillery. He had also witnessed the limitations of European feudal levies, slow musters, political infighting, and uneven commitment. By 1456, Hungary itself was politically unstable. The death of King Ladislaus had left a vacuum. Noble factions maneuvered for influence. Resources were strained. Many believed another Ottoman campaign was inevitable, but few agreed on how to respond. Hunyadi did not wait for consensus. He began reinforcing Belgrade months before the Ottoman army appeared. Supplies were stockpiled. Repairs were made to its 3 defensive rings: the lower town, the upper town, and the citadel dominating the heights. Cannons were mounted along the walls, though nowhere near the scale Mehmed could deploy. Garrison numbers remained limited, perhaps 5,000 to 7,000 professional soldiers at most. It was not enough to withstand a prolonged siege by the full Ottoman war machine. But Hunyadi was calculating beyond static defense. Belgrade's geography offered advantages. The Danube and Sava rivers created natural defensive barriers. Any besieging force would need to secure river crossings and prevent relief forces from arriving by water. If Hunyadi could assemble a relief army and coordinate it with the fortress garrison, the Ottomans would be forced into a multi-directional confrontation. Yet assembling such an army required something Europe rarely achieved: unity. At this moment, an unlikely figure entered the equation: Giovanni da Capistrano. Capistrano was not a general. He was a Franciscan friar, fiery, uncompromising, and deeply convinced that Europe stood on the brink of spiritual and physical annihilation. He preached crusade not as policy, but as existential necessity. His sermons ignited fervor among peasants, townsmen, and minor nobles who otherwise had little stake in Hungary's border wars. The army he helped gather was not a professional force. It was a mass of volunteers, poorly armed, unevenly trained, driven by faith and fear more than discipline. They carried farming tools alongside pikes. Their cohesion would be fragile, their morale unpredictable, but they were numerous. Hunyadi understood both the value and the danger of such a force. Untrained men could collapse under pressure. Panic could spread faster than flame. Yet sheer numbers, properly positioned, could disrupt even an experienced army. Meanwhile, Mehmed II was assembling one of the largest forces Europe had seen since the fall of Constantinople. Estimates vary, but contemporary sources suggest an Ottoman host of perhaps 60,000 to 80,000 soldiers, supported by a powerful artillery train and a substantial river fleet. The Janissaries formed the disciplined corps. Anatolian and Rumelian cavalry provided mobility. Engineers and artillery specialists prepared to replicate the success achieved 3 years earlier. The Sultan did not intend a symbolic siege. He intended annihilation of resistance. In early summer, the Ottoman army advanced north through Serbia. Towns fell, resistance crumbled. Refugees fled toward Belgrade's walls. Smoke from burning settlements signaled the scale of the advance long before the main army came into view. Inside Belgrade, tension hardened into grim determination. Food supplies were limited, reinforcements uncertain, disease threatened in confined quarters. Civilians crowded within the lower town. The knowledge of Constantinople's fate hung over every defender. They knew what Ottoman assault could look like. Relentless bombardment, breaches in stone, disciplined infantry surging through shattered gates. The psychological burden was immense. But Hunyadi's plan was already in motion. He would not allow Belgrade to be isolated completely. He prepared a river flotilla upriver, intending to break any Ottoman naval blockade. Speed would be essential. If the Ottomans sealed the Danube, Belgrade would be starved into submission. By July 1456, Mehmed's army encircled the fortress. His artillery began its deliberate work. Cannon fire echoed across the rivers. Day after day, stone cracked, towers splintered, dust filled the air. Ottoman engineers advanced trenches closer to walls, protecting gunners and sappers. The siege was methodical, not impulsive fury, but calculated pressure. Mehmed positioned his elite Janissaries opposite the most vulnerable sections of the wall, anticipating that breaches would eventually appear there. Cavalry screened the surrounding countryside, intercepting potential relief forces. The Ottoman river fleet anchored along the Danube, cutting off supply lines. From the Ottoman perspective, the outcome seemed inevitable. Belgrade was isolated, outnumbered, outgunned, and defended by a garrison already strained by shortages. Yet the fortress did not collapse. Instead, it endured. Each day the bombardment intensified, but the defenders worked through the night repairing walls with timber, earth, and debris. Fires were extinguished. Gaps were filled with makeshift barricades. The garrison rotated exhausted soldiers off the most dangerous positions. They were not fighting for glory. They were fighting for time. Because somewhere upriver, John Hunyadi was moving. He understood that once the Ottomans committed fully to an assault, the window for relief would close. The siege had to be broken not by patience, but by sudden disruption. His river flotilla, small, improvised, but determined, prepared to challenge the Ottoman naval blockade directly. Belgrade's survival now hinged on coordination between starving defenders and an approaching force that was itself fragile and improvised. The fortress walls trembled under cannon fire. The Danube carried the echoes of distant movement. And across the siege lines, both commanders calculated the same question: who would break first? By mid-July 1456, the siege of Belgrade had hardened into a contest of endurance, calculation, and nerve. The Ottoman encampment stretched across the plain south and east of the fortress, a vast and deliberate display of imperial power. Tents radiated outward from the Sultan's command pavilion in disciplined order. Artillery batteries were entrenched behind earthworks, angled toward the weakest segments of the walls. Siege trenches crept forward day by day, narrowing the distance between Ottoman engineers and the defenders' ramparts. The soundscape of the siege was relentless. Deep cannon reports, splintering stone, shouted orders in multiple languages, and the constant movement of men and animals preparing for the decisive assault. Mehmed II had studied siegecraft with uncommon seriousness for a ruler of his age. Constantinople had proven that fortified walls, however formidable, could be reduced by disciplined artillery and sustained pressure. At Belgrade, he applied similar principles but adjusted for geography. The fortress rose above the confluence of the Danube and Sava rivers, its upper citadel commanding elevated ground. Unlike Constantinople, which could be attacked from multiple axes with naval coordination in the Bosporus, Belgrade's river position complicated encirclement. To compensate, Mem deployed a substantial river fleet to block reinforcement or escape by water, anchoring ships across the Danube to create a floating barrier. If the fortress could not be fully isolated by land alone, it would be sealed by river. Inside Belgrade, the defenders faced a narrowing margin of survival. The professional garrison under John Hunyadi was composed of seasoned soldiers accustomed to frontier warfare, Hungarians, Serbs, and other Balkan veterans who understood Ottoman tactics intimately. Yet they were vastly outnumbered. Estimates suggest that while the Ottoman host may have approached 60,000 or more, the fortress held only a fraction of that number. Civilians crowded the lower town, stretching food supplies thinner with each passing day. Wells were guarded, rations were reduced. Sleep became irregular, interrupted by bombardment that struck at unpredictable intervals. Psychological strain accumulated not in dramatic bursts, but in slow erosion, men waiting in darkness, listening for the next impact. The Ottoman artillery focused particularly on the landward walls of the lower town, where sustained cannon fire began to produce visible fractures. Stones dislodged under repeated impact. Defensive towers lost structural integrity. Each breach was met by immediate repair efforts. Through the night, defenders hauled timber beams, rubble, and earth to reinforce damaged sections. Makeshift inner barricades were constructed behind compromised walls, creating layered resistance points should the outer defenses fail. The garrison understood that once the Ottomans sensed weakness, assault would follow swiftly. Meanwhile, Mem coordinated pressure from multiple elements of his army. The Janissaries, his elite infantry corps, disciplined and centrally controlled, were positioned strategically opposite the most heavily bombarded sectors. They were not yet committed to full assault. Instead, they waited in readiness, their presence both practical and psychological. Their reputation preceded them. Veterans of Constantinople, they were trained for urban and siege warfare, drilled to maintain cohesion under chaotic conditions. The Sultan intended them as a decisive instrument once the walls were sufficiently weakened. Supporting forces included Anatolian and Rumelian cavalry units, securing the countryside to prevent relief forces from approaching unnoticed. Scouts ranged outward along potential approach routes. Supply caravans maintained flow from the Ottoman rear, ensuring that the besieging army did not suffer the deprivation imposed upon the defenders. Mem's logistical preparation reflected careful planning. He did not intend a short demonstration of force. He intended systematic reduction. Yet even as Ottoman pressure intensified, movement upriver began to alter the strategic equation. Hunyadi had assembled a relief force combining his professional troops with a large body of crusading volunteers, inspired by the preaching of Giovanni da Capistrano. This force was unconventional. Alongside armored cavalry and experienced infantry marched peasants armed with scythes, clubs, and improvised weapons. Their morale was animated by religious conviction, but their military reliability remained uncertain. Hunyadi faced a delicate balance. He needed their numbers, yet he could not risk allowing undisciplined enthusiasm to disrupt coordinated operations. The key to relieving Belgrade lay not in a direct land assault against the full Ottoman army, which would have been suicidal, but in breaking the river blockade. If the Danube could be reopened, reinforcements and supplies could enter the fortress, transforming a slow siege into a dynamic confrontation. Hunyadi organized a flotilla of riverboats, smaller and less heavily armed than the Ottoman vessels, but maneuverable and driven by urgency. In late July, the relief flotilla advanced down the Danube toward the Ottoman naval barrier. The engagement that followed was chaotic and intensely physical. Unlike the Thunder's artillery duels on land, river combat devolved into close-quarter fighting. Boats collided, grappling hooks were thrown, archers and crossbowmen exchanged volleys at short range. Flames threatened to consume wooden hulls. Ottoman ships, larger and more numerous, initially appeared dominant, yet the narrowness of the river channel limited maneuverability. Hunyadi's men exploited this congestion, concentrating attacks on isolated vessels and disrupting formation. Crucially, the defenders inside Belgrade coordinated with the approaching flotilla. Seeing the river engagement unfold, they launched sorties from a fortress to attack Ottoman river positions from the flank. This sudden multi-directional pressure destabilized the Ottoman blockade. Ships caught between relief forces and fortress fire began to lose cohesion. Gradually, the barrier fractured. Several Ottoman vessels were destroyed or driven off. A corridor opened along the Danube. The psychological effect was immediate and profound. For days, the garrison had endured isolation. Now reinforcements entered the fortress. Supplies, however limited, restored a measure of stability. More importantly, morale shifted. The defenders were no longer waiting passively for breach. They were participants in an unfolding counterstroke. Men responded by intensifying bombardment. Recognizing that prolonged siege now risked attrition against an increasingly energized enemy, he prepared for decisive assault. Artillery fire increased in frequency and concentration. One major section of the lower town wall began to crumble visibly, its structural integrity compromised beyond temporary repair. Ottoman engineers advanced saps closer to the base, preparing to exploit the opening. Within the fortress, commanders assessed grim realities. Even with reinforcement, their numbers remained inferior. The crusader volunteers who had entered were brave but unevenly trained. If the walls were breached in force, maintaining order amid smoke, debris, and panicked civilians would test even experienced leaders. Hunyadi organized offensive sectors meticulously, assigning professional troops to critical points while positioning volunteers in supporting roles where their enthusiasm could be directed but controlled. On July 21st, the long-anticipated assault began. Under cover of sustained artillery fire, Ottoman infantry advanced toward the compromised walls of the lower town. Scaling ladders were raised. Siege towers attempted approach despite defensive fire. Arrows, bolts, and early firearms created a dense field of lethal exchange. The initial Ottoman waves absorbed heavy casualties, but maintained forward pressure. Janissaries followed in disciplined ranks, exploiting partial breaches where stone had collapsed into rubble slopes that could be climbed. Fighting within the lower town became fragmented and brutal. Visibility dropped amid smoke and dust. Commands were shouted and often unheard. Defenders fell back from outer barricades to inner positions. At several points, Ottoman troops penetrated into the city streets, raising banners on captured sections of wall. For a moment, it appeared the fortress might fracture internally, each sector isolated and overwhelmed in turn. Yet coordination held. Hunyadi personally directed counterattacks against penetrations, concentrating force at critical junctures rather than dispersing evenly. Narrow streets favored defenders familiar with the terrain. Makeshift barricades channeled Ottoman advances into kill zones where crossfire could be established. The Janissaries, though disciplined, found their formations disrupted by confined urban fighting. Momentum slowed. Casualties mounted on both sides. As evening approached, neither army possessed clear dominance. The lower town was contested ground, sections held by Ottomans, others by defenders, with fire and debris creating chaotic boundaries. Mehmed faced a decision: commit fully to night assault, risking disorganization, or consolidate and renew attack at dawn. He chose continued pressure, believing that exhaustion within the fortress would produce collapse before sunrise. But exhaustion was not one-sided. The Ottoman army had advanced, fought, and sustained losses under difficult conditions. Heat, smoke, and sustained resistance wore down assault units. The Janissaries, though elite, were not immune to fatigue. Meanwhile, the defenders, aware that this phase would determine survival, fought with the clarity of those who understood there was no fallback position beyond the citadel. In the darkness, scattered engagements continued. Fires illuminated broken walls. The Danube reflected distant flames. Both armies stood on the edge of culmination. The siege had evolved into direct confrontation. No longer merely artillery and attrition, but a test of command cohesion under extreme strain. And within that strain, a single miscalculation would determine which army broke first. Dawn broke over Belgrade on the morning of July 22nd, 1456, but the light did little to dispel the tension that had coiled throughout the night. The fortress, battered and scorched, seemed to breathe under the strain of anticipation. Smoke rose from damaged walls, mingling with the humid morning mist over the rivers. Both armies were acutely aware that the coming hours could determine the fate of the fortress and, by extension, the wider defensive posture of Central Europe. Commanders on both sides adjusted to the first rays of light with careful calculation, Mehmed II inspected the remaining breaches, signaling elite troops forward, while Hunyadi moved among his garrison and volunteers, reinforcing weak points and instilling an unspoken determination that the city would not fall. Every man could feel the weight of history pressing down, each aware that failure would not merely be a local disaster, but a symbolic victory for the Ottoman expansion into Europe. The Ottomans launched their renewed assault in a carefully orchestrated manner. Archers and crossbowmen targeted the inner defenders on the walls, while sappers attempted to widen breaches created the day before. Siege towers advanced under covering fire, and the disciplined ranks of the Janissaries moved in tight formation toward openings in the stone. Their approach was precise, the culmination of training and experience. Yet the narrow streets and uneven terrain within the lower town negated much of their advantage. The first units to climb into breach were met by a torrent of arrows and the improvised pikes of Capistrano's volunteers, who fought with desperation rather than skill. Where the Ottomans expected a rout, they encountered chaos instead, as defenders used every collapsed wall, rubble mound, and building corner to establish lethal defensive positions. The psychological pressure on the attackers became evident quickly. Each breach was fiercely contested. Janissaries who had stormed Constantinople now found themselves halted and isolated in narrow alleyways, where numbers counted for less than local familiarity. Soldiers were trapped in confined pockets, forcing hand-to-hand combat under the glare of flames and smoke. Commanders attempted to restore cohesion, shouting orders across the din, but miscommunication and panic occasionally spread, slowing advances and increasing casualties. Mehmed, observing from a slight rise behind the main lines, could see the strain on his troops. He realized that persistent frontal pressure, while conceptually sound, would consume his forces against an enemy that refused collapse. Strategic patience was required, but impatience to force the city's fall had already led to significant losses. Inside the fortress, Hunyadi's coordination was pivotal. He had divided his forces into layered defense sectors, placing professional soldiers at choke points and positioning volunteers in flanking positions to channel attackers into kill zones. Reinforcements from the river flotilla had brought not only food, but also the psychological boost of external support. Civilians, previously paralyzed by fear, were now enlisted to assist in moving debris, fortifying barricades, and maintaining lines of communication. Every hand contributed to resistance. The defenders' resilience turned the fortress into more than stone and timber. It became a network of lethal improvisation where the enemy's strength was neutralized by precise, small-unit tactical decisions. The advantage of terrain and preparation was now fully exploited, creating an environment in which numerical superiority was diminished by constrained spaces and organized resistance. As the day wore on, both armies faced mounting fatigue. The Ottomans had pressed hard, yet each attempt to break through the lower town had exacted a heavy toll. Casualties accumulated visibly, bodies littering streets and ramparts, while cries of the wounded and dying added to the chaos. Hunyadi rotated his soldiers carefully, ensuring that the most experienced offenders were positioned where danger was greatest, while less trained volunteers covered sectors that could absorb initial shocks. The psychological impact of seeing reinforcements arrive, even modestly, bolstered morale. The defenders could not ignore the suffering around them, but they drew strength from survival and the knowledge that they had transformed desperate circumstances into a viable defense. Confidence, hard-earned and fragile, became a tangible factor on the battlefield. By late afternoon, Mehmed II faced a critical tactical decision. The breaches were incomplete. The defenders remained concentrated and capable. Direct assault promised further attrition, and prolonged engagement carried the risk of the fortress receiving additional relief. Furthermore, the Danube corridor remained contested. The river had allowed some reinforcements and supplies to enter, and its continued openness threatened the security of Ottoman siege operations. Mehmed's engineers worked feverishly to establish additional pontoon bridges and forward batteries, but Hunyadi's small fleet disrupted construction efforts intermittently. The Sultan's options narrowed. Pressing a full assault might succeed eventually, but the cost in manpower and morale could be decisive. His presence, however commanding, could not substitute for the attritional realities now unfolding on the battlefield. At this juncture, nature and circumstance intervened. A sudden thunderstorm swept over the Danube plain, drenching men, soddening gunpowder, and turning siege earthworks into treacherous mud. Artillery effectiveness dropped sharply. Ottoman river operations slowed dramatically, giving Hunyadi's flotilla further opportunities to maneuver and supply the fortress. Rain and thunder created auditory confusion, masking the approach of both defenders and attackers in certain sectors. Soldiers on both sides were exhausted, chilled, and increasingly uncertain of the battlefield's coherence. Commanders had to rely on experience and instinct more than direct observation. The storm, indifferent to allegiance, reshaped the tactical environment and highlighted the fragility inherent in sustained siege operations under environmental strain. Seizing the moment, Hunyadi launched a coordinated counterattack. Small groups of infantry emerged from the lower town gates, moving swiftly along less contested sectors to strike at isolated Ottoman positions. Archers positioned on the inner walls targeted exposed sappers and artillery crews, while volunteers charged into trenches to disrupt ongoing tunneling and repair efforts. The impact was sudden and disorienting. Ottoman units, already fatigued and partially disorganized by rain and mud, found themselves under simultaneous pressure from multiple directions. Panic, subtle at first, began to ripple outward. Soldiers struggled to maintain formation in narrow approaches and treacherous terrain, where the disciplined order of the Janissaries offered less advantage than confined streets and barricaded positions. Coordination faltered, and units began to withdraw in piecemeal fashion. Mehmed II, witnessing the sudden deterioration, ordered reserves forward. Yet the Sultan's decision came too late. The combination of environmental disruption, defender initiative, and concentrated counterattacks had created a tactical environment the Ottomans could not recover from swiftly. Withdrawal became not a choice but a necessity. Exhausted troops retreated from the lower town, abandoning ladders, siege towers, and artillery positions. The battlefield remained littered with casualties and equipment, a testament to the intensity and chaos of the confrontation. Hunyadi's forces, though battered, had regained control of critical defensive positions. The fortress remained intact, and the immediate threat of capture had passed.